Alrighty guys, just a warning, the next few lessons until I finish up Unit 2 are going to be as bare bones as I can make them, so honestly today is about as fancy as it's going to get until we reach Unit 3, just because I am trying to finish these up for us. So let's talk about ecosystem services. What is an ecosystem service? It's something that healthy ecosystems provide to humans and also to the rest of the environment. So some examples, we get food from the ecosystem, we get timber like wood so that we can build things, our crops get pollinated by the ecosystems, we get clean water and air. Mitigation in the extreme weather mitigation means to make less severe. So since we have extreme weather will pop up, especially more frequently now and in the future. If we have healthy ecosystems in place, they can help make the effects of that severe weather a little less disastrous. And then also decomposition of waste. And this isn't a full list, this is just a partial list. So there are 4 different types of ecosystem services: provisioning services, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. And we're going to talk about each of them in detail. So let's talk about the types of ecosystem services. Provisioning services are usually goods, so physical things that you can get from the ecosystem. Here are some examples: food, drinking water, and that food could include things like seafood, game if anybody hunts, crops that you grow, wild foods that you just kind of pick, and spices. Raw materials, things like lumber from forests, skins, meaning things that produce like leather, fuel wood for burning, organic matter, fodder for feeding animals, and fertilizer. Genetic resources are also something important. For example, if you have, say, a species of something like wheat, and you're growing a lot of wheat that's very genetically similar and it gets at risk of being wiped out by a disease. Well, if you have a wild, non domesticated version of wheat around, you can actually try and breed those two so that way some of the genes or genetic diversity in the wild wheat can help improve the genetic diversity of your wheat. And we'll talk more about that when we get into Unit 5 and talk about agriculture. And biogenic materials just means anything that's produced by organisms. So, for example, here, plant fibers that you can make into clothes and other materials, things like cotton. Medicinal resources, a lot of our medications are, a lot of them are extracted from or derived from plants, sometimes animals. We also can test things on organisms in the wild, laboratory testing, which is all, ethically regulated. We can get energy from the ecosystem, so we can get hydropower. There's biomass, there's natural gas. We also obviously get fossil fuels. And then ornamental resources, decorative things. We also get pets. Various things, anything physical you can take from the environment. Regulating services are more about processes. These are things that the environment or the ecosystems do for us. So, for one example, there's erosion control. When you have a healthy ecosystem with lots of plants in place, they can help keep dirt and soil from getting washed away. The healthy ecosystems purify water and air. They can also take in carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, so they'll take in CO2, and we can call that also absorption. So sequestration is a term we're going to see again when we talk about possible solutions to climate change, and some of the possible things that have been recommended for what we can do to try and mitigate or make less severe the effects of climate change. Forests can also help regulate climate. All of these things can decompose waste, and they can also detoxify some things if there are some pollutants in the environment. Sometimes a healthy ecosystem can help weed those out. Predation helps to regulate prey populations. A lot of species that could otherwise become pests may be controlled by their natural predators or parasites. Also helps with disease control. Pollination is a really big service that we'll talk about later. They can regulate disturbances. For example, when there is a flood. If you have wetlands around, which we'll talk about in a moment, they can actually help protect against the like a severe flood. Then there are cultural services. These aren't physical things. These are non-material things that can benefit society and culture at large. So, some cultural examples, uses of nature in books, film, painting, folklore, national symbols, advertising. For example, what is the national symbol, national bird, or national animal of the United States? It's the bald eagle. And so, because of that kind of national symbolism, when the bald eagle was starting to become dangerously endangered, a lot of people in the U.S. were like, "No, this is our national symbol. We need to keep it around so we can, have pride in it." Advertising, hey, you've got that Geico gecko, if nothing else. Spiritual and historical, so you can use nature for religious or heritage value, like this is the land of my ancestors. A lot of recreational experiences. So ecotourism has become a booming business in the last half a century. You've got pristine, beautiful wildlands. People want to go there and see, relatively undisturbed ecosystem or see a different ecosystem. And we'll talk later about some of the countries that are really big into ecotourism, like Costa Rica is really heavily reliant on ecotourism. Outdoor sports, recreation, last time you went to a park or went camping or hiking. You can use natural systems for field trips. Sorry, we're not going to get to do those because those cost money, but we can make discoveries from what we find in ecosystems. There's some therapeutic value from ecosystems. For example, there's animal assisted therapy, ecotherapy, which I've not heard of before this, but I would assume helping to get people maybe with anxiety or stress disorders, helping to kind of mentally heal them using nature. Social forestry, which I've also not heard of before. And then supporting services are things in the background that kind of help Earth perform all these other ecosystem services. So these are kind of the underlying things that help keep all the other ecosystem services or allow them to happen. And some of them kind of overlap with the regulating services, so they may seem the same. So, some examples: photosynthesis or primary production. Remember, photosynthesis and primary production support the entire ecosystem. Without this, you have no food web. And without a food web, a lot of the organisms that we eat would not be available. Nutrient cycling. In order for us to grow crops, for example, we need nutrient cycling. Think about it. How much money do people spend on fertilizer a year? Whereas if we had the natural decomposers in an area and weren't necessarily overwhelming them with extra waste material, they could probably do all that for free. Creation of soils is something important. Just like what we talked about when we looked at succession in class, when you don't have soil, you can't have anything living there. The water cycle is also very important. Availability of water is a huge deal. They provide habitats. And now let's focus on a specific ecosystem. So we're going to look at what the wetlands do to kind of support organisms. Especially us. So a lot of organisms use wetlands as a habitat, and we eat some of those organisms. Other organisms will provide other services that will kind of help us out. But I don't know, I'm not a fishing person, but if you've gone fishing, you may have gone fishing in something like a bayou or a swamp or a marsh. That would be an ecosystem service provided by that wetland. A big thing that wetlands do is they are a large, usually some kind of slow moving mass of water, and they can absorb a lot of water. So here we see dissipate stream energy for flood control. Well, this wetland is going to absorb extra water. So let's say you have a lot of flooding uphill. Let's say you've got a ton of rain coming down on these hills. Well, usually that's going to swell a river and it's going to make it overflow its banks, and that's when you get flooding. However, if you have wetlands in the area, they can absorb some of that extra water and kind of keep it from going downstream and flooding the areas downstream. This is a really big problem, for example, in Houston, where they have drained a lot of the wetlands that for the rivers that are draining into the Galveston Bay. And without that, when hurricanes hit Houston now, there is a lot more flooding than they used to be because they've taken out the wetlands that were helping to control that flooding. The plants that are in wetlands can absorb a lot of nutrients and other chemicals from the water and filter it. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. The plants that are there, especially if they partially decompose and fall to the bottom of the pond, that can sequester or store away large amounts of carbon, which is great for us trying to mitigate or reduce the effects of climate change. And it's a vital habitat for a lot of organisms. Wetlands are highly productive, and there's a lot of food there for a lot of different organisms. And so a lot of them will either, stop there on their way north for the summer, or on their way south for the winter. They're breeding grounds for a lot of birds. And so without wetlands, you lose a lot of these ecosystem services. And then some people like to go and hang out in the wetlands for fun. They probably do camping, hiking, fishing, especially. All right, so let's look at how our activities can disrupt ecosystem services. And notice this term, anthropogenic. We need to take a look at that term because it's going to become very common throughout the rest of our class. And so I'm going to use the term anthropogenic all the time. So what does it mean? Well, the anthropo in anthropogenic comes from, means relating to humanity. And genic means caused by. So what I'm going to ask you to do on your notes is I want you to come up with, based on those roots, a meaning for the term anthropogenic. And no, I'm not giving that away to you. So let's talk about some consequences. Let's talk about how humans have affected some wetlands in Florida called the Florida Everglades. And first, we're going to split this up into two different things. So we're going to talk about ecological consequences first. The Florida Everglades used to take up what looks like close to half the state. And it was this large wetland. A lot of water was moving through it, and it provided a lot of services. But a lot of people live in Florida. So what they would do is they would drain the wetlands, start putting farmland, start putting cities, towns, etc. there. And eventually, I think 4/5 of the Florida Everglades were just gone. When that happened, because you removed a lot of water from the area, that caused an increase in wildfires in the summer, which, if you ever watch the news, wildfires are an increasing problem and they're not a good thing to have. There was a 90% decrease in the populations of wading birds, a 75 to 95% decrease in the populations of other vertebrates, spinal cord having organisms. So a lot of wildlife loss. One of the things that can also happen is a lot of these wetlands can help to mitigate some of the coastal flooding. Some other things, we are causing climate change. Well, we're making climate change worse, more dramatic than it otherwise might have been. And that will lead to coastal flooding because the sea levels are rising. We destroy habitats, which can lead to species extinction, loss of biodiversity, which can then just disrupt food webs. And climate change causes massive environmental changes that we'll talk about in a lot more detail in Unit 9. This can cause species extinction or endangerment of species, which throws the entire ecosystem out of whack, and then it's no longer able to provide services for us. So some economic consequences, ecosystems in the environment do a lot of things for us for free. We tend to take free things for granted, but a lot of ecologists are talking about maybe we should start setting a monetary value on the things that ecosystems provide, so that way we'll learn to value them. Because once an ecosystem service is gone, it's usually very expensive to try and use technology or other solutions to try and fix that problem and provide that service. So here's an example. In New York City, the quality of their drinking water, which is regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, the quality of their drinking water was too low. So the government said, you have to fix this. So they had a couple of options. One, they could do like a lot of cities and build a sewage treatment plant. Another thing they could do is there was a watershed with wetlands that had supplied water for the city. What happened is as the water flowed through, plants absorbed extra nutrients, maybe some chemicals, and they naturally cleaned the water. As well as just water flowing through soil helps filter it as well. So what they did is they took that watershed and they cleaned it up. They reduced the amount of sewage that went into it. They reduced the amount of pesticides that went into it. And then soon enough, all the natural, nutrient cycling processes and organisms were able to improve the water quality by removing a lot of the extra, chemicals from pesticides and also decomposing any sewage or other rotting stuff that was coming into the water, which sounds pretty nasty. And it's estimated that so it cost about $1 to $1.5 billion or so to do this restoration. That is in comparison to how much it would have cost to build a water filtration plant. It would have cost $6 to $8 billion plus $300 million a year in order to run it. So the ecosystem that they restored helped to basically save the city like billions of dollars, which can then be spent on other things. All right, that's it for this lesson. We are going to do island biogeography next.